A billionaire woman found a homeless man sleeping among trash bags in a dark alley. When their eyes met, he whispered two words that froze her heart. "You returned." She had no idea who he was, but something deep inside her soul recognized him. She decided to take him home, and what happened next changed both their lives forever in ways no one could have imagined. Secrets from the past came to light, lost memories returned, and a love that seemed impossible became the most beautiful miracle. A story of second chances, healing, and the power of true love that conquers all. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart and remind you that some bonds can never be broken. Subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from. The golden afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom as Victoria Ashford adjusted the delicate straps of her crimson velvet gown. Another charity gala, another evening of polite conversations and calculated smiles. At 34, she had mastered the art of appearing engaged while her mind wandered to quarterly reports and acquisition deals. The Ashford fashion empire demanded her constant attention, and she gave it willingly. It was safer than giving her attention to anything else. As the final speeches droned on about community impact and social responsibility, Victoria found herself studying the faces around her. Wealthy donors, politicians, socialites, all playing their parts in this elaborate theater of philanthropy. She knew most of them had ulterior motives, just as she did. Tonight's event would generate excellent publicity for Ashford Industries, and the tax write-offs didn't hurt either. When the evening finally concluded, Victoria declined the usual after-party invitations with practiced grace. Her driver waited by the black Bentley, but something made her wave him away. The October air carried a crispness that reminded her of her childhood, when she used to walk through Central Park with her grandmother. Those were simpler times, before board meetings and hostile takeovers became her daily reality. Without quite knowing why, Victoria found herself walking through the older section of the city. Her heels clicked against cobblestones that had witnessed countless stories over the decades. The narrow alley between two historic buildings beckoned to her, perhaps because it offered a reprieve from the main street's glaring lights and persistent noise. That's when she saw him. Among the cardboard boxes and scattered newspapers, a man sat with his back against the brick wall. His eyes were closed, but something about his posture suggested he wasn't really sleeping. Even through the grime and worn clothing, there was something oddly dignified about him. Something that made Victoria stop walking and simply stare. His hair was dark beneath a faded baseball cap, and stubble covered his jaw. The jacket he wore had seen better days, but it was arranged carefully around his shoulders. Most people would have hurried past, perhaps dropping some spare change if they were feeling generous, but Victoria found herself unable to move. When his eyes opened and met hers, the world seemed to shift on its axis. They were the most startling shade of green she had ever seen, and they held a recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if she were a memory he had been trying to recall for years. The man's lips curved into the faintest smile, and he spoke just two words that would haunt her for months to come. "You returned." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. The carefully constructed walls around her emotions began to crack. She took a step closer, her expensive shoes crunching on fallen leaves. "Do I know you?" she heard herself ask, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. The man studied her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable. Instead, she felt drawn to him like a moth to flame. There was something achingly familiar about the way he tilted his head, the way his fingers drummed silently against his knee. "Maybe you do," he said finally. "Maybe we both just forgot how to remember." Any rational person would have walked away. Victoria Ashford had built her empire on rational decisions, calculated risks, and emotional detachment. But standing in that alley as the sun set behind the buildings, rationality seemed like a foreign concept. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, surprising herself with the invitation. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced down at his worn clothing, then back at her designer gown. "I'm not exactly dressed for the Four Seasons." "I wasn't thinking of the Four Seasons," Victoria replied. "I was thinking of somewhere more private, somewhere we could talk." An hour later, Victoria found herself doing something she had never done before, bringing a complete stranger into her home. The Ashford mansion sat on 5 acres of prime real estate overlooking the Hudson River. As they walked through the iron gates and up the circular driveway, she watched the man's reaction carefully. He didn't gawk at the Italian marble or the hand-carved columns. Instead, he He paused by the garden that bordered the pathway. Even in the dim lighting, she could see him studying the neglected flower beds with what looked like professional interest. "You have good soil here," he observed, crouching down to touch the earth. "Just needs some attention." Victoria had purchased the property for its investment potential and privacy. She had never given much thought to the gardens, but something about the way he spoke made her see the space differently. They settled in the conservatory, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the grounds. Victoria's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, brought coffee and small cakes without being asked. The elderly woman had worked for the Ashford family for over 20 years, and Victoria caught her studying their guest with curious eyes. As they sat across from each other in the elegant space, Victoria struggled to understand what had compelled her to bring him here. She prided herself on being methodical, logical. She didn't make impulsive decisions, especially ones that involved strange men from dark alleys. "What's your name?" she asked, cradling the warm coffee cup between her palms. The man was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes distant. "I'm not sure I remember," he said finally. "It's been a while since anyone asked." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Victoria was accustomed to people who spoke in careful phrases, weighing each word for maximum impact. This man seemed incapable of anything but truth. "Well, you'll need something for me to call you," she said. "What feels right to you?" He considered this, looking around the conservatory with its potted palms and delicate orchids. "Raphael," he said eventually. "It sounds dignified, quiet." "Raphael," Victoria repeated, testing the name. It suited him somehow. "And you?" Raphael asked. "Do you have a name? Or should I just keep thinking of you as the woman in red?" "Victoria," she replied, then added, "Victoria Ashford." Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he didn't react the way most people did when they heard her family name. No sudden deference or calculating interest. Just a nod, as if she had told him something he already suspected. They talked until well past midnight, though the conversation felt more like a careful dance than an exchange of information. Raphael spoke in fragments, mentions of gardens he might have tended, books he thought he had read, places that seemed familiar but distant. Victoria found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her loneliness in the vast mansion, her uncertainty about the direction of her life, her feeling that success had become a golden cage. When Raphael finally stood to leave, Victoria felt a strange panic rise in her chest. The evening had been the most genuine conversation she had experienced in years, and the thought of returning to her isolated routine felt unbearable. "You could stay," she said quickly, then felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I mean, there are guest rooms, if you need a place for the night." Raphael studied her face for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm not exactly the kind of guest you're used to having." Victoria thought of the business associates and social climbers who usually graced her home. People who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes, who measured every word for its potential advantage. "No," she said, "you're not." That first night set a pattern that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Raphael took the guest room in the east wing, a comfortable space with its own bathroom and a view of the unkempt gardens. Victoria lay awake in her master suite, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through her home. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, helping her prepare breakfast. The sight of him, still wearing yesterday's clothes but somehow looking more at home than she ever felt in her own house, stirred something deep in her chest. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Victoria would leave for her office each morning, dealing with the complex demands of running a fashion empire. Raphael would spend his days working in the gardens, transforming the neglected landscape with a skill that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his muscle memory. Mrs. Chen became Raphael's unlikely ally. The housekeeper had worked for the Ashford family long enough to recognize loneliness when she saw it, and she had watched Victoria retreat further into herself with each passing year. Now she observed her employer with the sharp eyes of someone who had raised 3 children of her own. The changes in Victoria were subtle but unmistakable. She lingered over breakfast instead of rushing to her car. She asked Raphael about his progress in the gardens, listening intently as he described soil conditions and planting schedules. Most telling of all, she had stopped working late every evening, choosing instead to walk through the grounds as the sun set. But not everyone was pleased with the new arrangement. Richard Hawthorne, Victoria's business partner and oldest friend, made his concerns clear during a tense board meeting in late October. The Ashford fashion empire was in the middle of delicate merger negotiations, and Victoria's distraction was becoming noticeable. "The investors are asking questions, Victoria," Richard said, as they reviewed quarterly projections. About your judgment. About this man you've taken in. Victoria's spine straightened. My personal life is not a matter for board discussion. It is when it affects the company, Richard replied, his voice careful but firm. We've built something extraordinary together. Don't let sentiment put it at risk. That evening, Victoria found Raphael in the garden, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. He was planting bulbs for spring flowers, his movements methodical and purposeful. The sight of him working with such care for something he might not be there to see moved her in ways she couldn't explain. Do you ever wonder about your life before? She asked, settling onto a stone bench nearby. Raphael's hands stilled in the soil. Every day, he admitted. But it's like trying to remember a dream. The harder I focus, the more it slips away. Are you afraid of what you might remember? Raphael was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Sometimes, he said finally, but I'm more afraid of never remembering at all. That night, Victoria dreamed of a man in a tuxedo standing at the altar of a grand cathedral. In the dream, she was walking down the aisle in a flowing white gown, her heart full of hope and certainty. But when she reached the altar, the man was gone, leaving only empty space where her future should have been. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a name on her lips that she couldn't quite recall. November brought the first serious challenges to their strange arrangement. A gossip columnist had somehow learned about Raphael's presence at the mansion, and speculation ran wild in the society pages. Some painted Victoria as a charitable saint taking in the unfortunate. Others suggested more scandalous motivations. The attention made Raphael withdraw. He spent longer hours in the garden, avoiding the main areas of the house when visitors were present. Victoria could see the stress wearing on him, the way his shoulders tensed when cars pulled into the driveway. The breaking point came during Victoria's annual Thanksgiving gathering, a formal affair attended by business associates and social connections. Victoria had debated whether to include Raphael, finally deciding that hiding him would only fuel more speculation. She found him in his room an hour before the guests arrived, staring out the window at the garden he had transformed. The autumn landscape was spectacular, carefully pruned trees creating dramatic silhouettes against the darkening sky, late blooming flowers adding splashes of color to the fading light. You don't have to do this, Raphael said without turning around. I can make myself scarce. Victoria approached him slowly, studying his reflection in the window glass. I want you there, she said quietly, but only if you want to be there. When Raphael finally turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. It was a look of such tender gratitude that she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. The dinner party was a disaster of the most civilized kind. The guests were polite to Raphael, but their curiosity was palpable. Victoria watched them studying him, trying to place him in their understanding of her world. Raphael handled the attention with remarkable grace, speaking little but listening carefully to the conversations around him. It was during the dessert course that Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. Victoria excused herself and followed the housekeeper to the kitchen, where she found her sitting heavily in a chair, one hand pressed to her chest. Mrs. Chen, what's wrong? The elderly woman looked up with tears in her eyes. That man, she whispered. Mr. Raphael. I know who he is. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What do you mean? Mrs. Chen reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small, faded photograph. With trembling hands, she placed it on the kitchen counter where Victoria could see it clearly. The photograph showed a younger version of Victoria standing beside a man in a dark suit. They were both smiling, his arm around her waist in a gesture of intimate familiarity. The man's face was clean-shaven and his hair was shorter, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were Raphael's eyes. Where did you get this? Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen wiped at her eyes with a corner of her apron. I found it years ago, after he disappeared. You were so heartbroken. I didn't want to remind you. I should have thrown it away, but I couldn't. I kept thinking maybe someday. Victoria stared at the photograph, memories beginning to surface like bubbles rising from the depths of a lake. A man who made her laugh until her sides ached. Walks through Central Park on Sunday mornings. Plans for a future that seemed as solid as the ground beneath her feet. And then, nothing. He had simply vanished 3 days before their wedding, leaving no explanation, no forwarding address, no trace of where he had gone or why. His name, Victoria whispered, the memory finally breaking free. His name was Jonathan. Mrs. Chen nodded. fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Jonathan Blake. He loved you more than life itself. And then, one day, he was just gone. Victoria's hands shook as she picked up the photograph. How could she have forgotten? How could she have buried those memories so completely that she didn't recognize the man she had once planned to marry? But even as the questions swirled in her mind, she knew the answer. The pain of his abandonment had been so devastating that her mind had done what it needed to do to survive. It had locked those memories away where they couldn't hurt her anymore. Now, looking at the photograph, she remembered everything. The way Jonathan used to hum while he cooked breakfast. The garden he had started behind her old apartment, teaching her the names of flowers and the patience required to nurture growing things. The ring he had given her, a simple platinum band that she had thrown into the Hudson River in a fit of rage and heartbreak. She looked through the kitchen doorway toward the dining room, where Raphael was listening politely to one of Richard's business stories. He had no idea who he really was, no memory of the love they had shared or the devastation his disappearance had caused, but Victoria remembered now, and the knowledge felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The man she had loved and lost was sitting at her dinner table, calling himself by a different name, with no recognition of their shared past. "What should I do?" she asked Mrs. Chen, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The housekeeper squeezed her hand gently. "That depends on what you want more, dear one. The truth, or the chance to start over." Victoria stared at the photograph until the faces began to blur. In the dining room, she could hear the murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware against china. Her guests were waiting for her return, but she felt paralyzed by the weight of what she now knew. When she finally rejoined the party, Victoria moved through the remainder of the evening like an actress playing a role she had performed countless times before. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and made all the expected social gestures. But inside, her mind raced with fragments of recovered memories. She watched Raphael, Jonathan, as he navigated the social dynamics with quiet grace. There were moments when she caught glimpses of the man she had once known, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, as if warming his palms, the slight tilt of his head when he was truly listening to someone speak, the unconscious way he straightened the silverware beside his plate. How many nights had she watched him perform these same small rituals in her old apartment? How many mornings had she awakened to find him already dressed, standing by the window with his coffee, planning their day together? After the last guest departed, Victoria found herself alone with Raphael in the conservatory. The space that had become their informal sanctuary now felt charged with unspoken truths. Raphael sensed her distraction immediately. "You seem different tonight," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. Distant. Victoria studied his face, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker of memory that might indicate he was beginning to remember who he really was. But his green eyes held only concern for her well-being, nothing more. "Do you ever have dreams?" she asked carefully. "Dreams that feel more like memories?" Raphael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the darkened windows. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There's this recurring one about a church. Stone steps, white flowers everywhere, and there's a woman, but I can never see her face clearly. She's wearing white, and she's waiting for something, or someone." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She remembered their wedding rehearsal, the way the afternoon light had streamed through the cathedral's stained glass windows, painting everything in jeweled colors. She had worn a white sundress that day, standing at the altar while the wedding coordinator explained the processional. "What happens in the dream?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Raphael's brow furrowed with concentration. "She keeps turning around, looking for someone who should be there but isn't. And there's this overwhelming feeling of loss, like something precious has been broken beyond repair." The description cut through Victoria like a blade. That was exactly how she had felt, standing at the altar 3 days later, waiting for a groom who would never appear. The church full of guests, the flowers wilting in the heat, the gradual realization that Jonathan was truly gone. But now, looking at Raphael's troubled expression, she began to wonder if his disappearance had been as voluntary as she had always assumed. What if something had happened to him? What if the trauma that had stolen his memories had also stolen him from her, on what should have been the happiest day of their lives? The questions tormented her through a sleepless night. Victoria paced her bedroom, holding the photograph that Mrs. Chen had entrusted to her care. Every rational part of her mind urged caution. If Raphael truly had no memory of their past, perhaps it was better to leave things as they were. They were building something new together, something that felt genuine and unencumbered by the weight of old wounds. But another part of her, the part that had never stopped loving Jonathan Blake, wanted desperately to find a way back to who they had once been. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Victoria was reviewing contracts in her home office when Mrs. Chen announced that Richard Hawthorne had arrived unannounced. Richard's expression was grim as he entered the room, closing the door firmly behind him. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "About your houseguest." Victoria set down her pen carefully. "I wasn't aware that Raphael was any concern of yours." Richard pulled out his tablet and placed it on her desk. The screen displayed a news article from one of the city's most influential business publications. The headline read, "Ashford heiress's mysterious companion raises questions about company leadership." The article was accompanied by a photograph that had clearly been taken with a telephoto lens. It showed Victoria and Raphael walking through her garden, their heads close together in intimate conversation. The caption speculated about Raphael's identity and questioned whether Victoria's judgment was compromised by an inappropriate relationship. "This is just the beginning," Richard said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've heard rumors that some of our biggest investors are considering pulling out of the merger. They're saying you've become unstable, unreliable." Victoria felt anger flare in her chest. "Based on what? Because I've shown kindness to someone who needed help? Based on the fact that no one knows who this man is or where he came from," Richard replied. "Based on the fact that you've changed, Victoria. You're distracted, unfocused. The board members are starting to ask questions about your ability to lead the company through this critical transition." The merger Richard referenced was the culmination of years of strategic planning. Ashford Fashion Empire was poised to acquire a European luxury brand, a deal that would establish them as a major player in the international market. It was everything Victoria had worked toward since taking control of the company from her father. But sitting in her office, listening to Richard's concerns, Victoria found that the merger seemed less important than it had just weeks ago. Her priorities had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You're asking me to choose," she said finally. Richard's expression softened slightly. "I'm asking you to be smart about this. Send him away, at least until the merger is complete. Show the board that you're still the focused, rational leader they've always known." "And if I refuse?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Then we might lose everything we've built together." After Richard left, Victoria sat alone in her office, staring at the photograph on her tablet screen. She and Raphael looked happy in the image, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that transcended mere friendship. But now that happiness felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. That afternoon, she found Raphael in the garden, working on a new section near the property's eastern border. He had transformed the neglected space into something magical. Meandering paths lined with carefully selected plants, hidden benches placed to take advantage of the best views, a small fountain that he had somehow coaxed back to life. "It's beautiful," Victoria said, genuinely moved by what he had created. Raphael straightened, wiping soil from his hands on a rag he kept tucked in his belt. "It's just the beginning," he said with quiet pride. "Wait until spring when everything starts to bloom. It'll be like stepping into another world." The enthusiasm in his voice made Victoria's heart ache. This garden was more than just landscaping to Raphael. It was his way of creating beauty in a world that had shown him too much ugliness. It was his gift to her, though he probably didn't fully understand that himself. "Raphael," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. He studied her face with the perceptive gaze that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Something's troubling you," he observed. "The same thing that was bothering you last night?" Victoria took a breath, steeling herself for what she needed to say. "There are people who think our friendship is inappropriate, that it's affecting my ability to run my company." Raphael's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes. "And what do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think," Victoria said carefully, "that maybe they have a point. Not about inappropriateness, but about distraction. I've built my life around my work, and lately, I find myself thinking more about other things. Such as whether you're happy here, whether this arrangement is fair to either of us, whether we're both avoiding difficult truths because they're easier to ignore." Raphael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the garden around them. "Are you asking me to leave?" he said finally. The direct question cut through all of Victoria's careful diplomacy. The honest answer was no, she didn't want him to leave. But the responsible answer, the answer that protected everything she had worked to build, was more complicated. "I'm asking what you think would be best," she said. hating herself for the cowardice of the response. Raphael nodded slowly, as if he had expected this conversation eventually. "I think," he said, "that people like us don't get to have simple answers to complicated questions." That evening, Raphael didn't join Victoria for dinner. Mrs. Chen reported that he had eaten early and retired to his room. Victoria found herself picking at her meal, listening for sounds of movement from the east wing and hearing only silence. Around midnight, unable to sleep, she walked through the house toward the conservatory. As she passed the main parlor, she heard the soft sound of piano music drifting through the partially open door. Victoria paused in the hallway, her heart racing. She had heard Raphael play before, always late at night when he thought no one was listening. But tonight, the melody was different. It was a piece she recognized, though it took her several moments to place it. It was the song that was supposed to play during their wedding processional. Jonathan had chosen it himself, spending hours at the piano in her old apartment, working out the arrangement. She had teased him about being more nervous about the music than the ceremony itself. Now, listening to Raphael play the same melody with heartbreaking precision, Victoria felt the last of her resistance crumble. Whatever trauma had stolen his memories, whatever circumstances had led him to that alley where she found him, Jonathan was still there beneath the surface. The music proved it. She pushed open the parlor door and stepped inside. Raphael's hand stilled on the keys as he became aware of her presence. "That's a beautiful piece," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you remember where you learned it?" Raphael's fingers traced the keys without pressing them, as if the melody lived in his muscle memory even when his mind couldn't access its origins. "No," he said quietly, "but it feels important somehow, like it's connected to something I should remember." Victoria moved closer to the piano, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Maybe some memories are too precious to lose completely," she said. "Maybe they find ways to survive even when everything else is gone." Raphael looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition. For a moment, the space between them seemed charged with possibility. Then Raphael's expression shuddered, and he closed the piano lid with careful finality. "I should go," he said, rising from the bench. "It's late." But instead of leaving, he paused beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. There was something he wanted to say. She could sense it in the tension of his posture, the way his hands flexed at his sides. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that these weeks here have been the happiest I can remember. Maybe the happiest I've ever been." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the piano and the echoes of a melody that belonged to a love story she was only beginning to remember. The next few days passed in a careful dance of avoidance. Raphael threw himself into his garden work with increased intensity, often starting before dawn and continuing until well after sunset. Victoria buried herself in company business, attending meetings and reviewing reports with a focus that impressed even Richard. But despite their efforts to maintain distance, they kept finding themselves drawn back to each other. Victoria would discover herself standing at her office window, watching Raphael work in the garden below. Raphael would appear in doorways when she was passing through the house, as if he had been listening for her footsteps. The tension between them was becoming unbearable, a constant undercurrent that affected everything they did. Mrs. Chen watched them both with worried eyes, clearly wanting to intervene but uncertain how. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when Victoria discovered that Raphael was gone. She had awakened early, drawn by an impulse to check on the progress of his latest garden project. But when she looked out her bedroom window, the grounds were empty. A check of his room revealed that his few belongings were missing, along with the man himself. Mrs. Chen found Victoria standing in Raphael's empty room, staring at the neatly made bed. "He left this for you," the housekeeper said quietly, holding out a folded piece of paper. Victoria's hands shook as she opened the letter. Raphael's handwriting was careful and precise, each word chosen with obvious deliberation. "Victoria," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Please don't look for me. This isn't about you or anything you've done. It's about me finally accepting that some things can't be fixed, no matter how much we might want them to be. You've given me more kindness than I had any right to expect. You took a broken man from an alley and showed him what it meant to feel human again. But I can see that my presence here is causing you pain, and I won't be responsible for destroying something you've worked so hard to build. You deserve someone whole, someone who can stand beside you without casting shadows over your accomplishments. I'm not that person, and I may never be. The gaps in my memory aren't just missing time. They're missing pieces of my soul, and I don't know how to get them back. Thank you for the garden. Thank you for the music. Thank you for seeing something worth saving in a man who had forgotten how to save himself. Be happy, Victoria. You deserve all the happiness the world has to offer." The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom, in smaller handwriting, were 4 words that stopped Victoria's heart. "I remember your laugh." Victoria read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Then she was moving, grabbing her coat and keys, pushing past Mrs. Chen's concerned protests. She had to find him. Whatever wall existed between them, whatever obstacles stood in their way, she couldn't let him disappear again. She drove to the alley where they had first met, but it was empty except for scattered trash and faded graffiti. She checked homeless shelters and soup kitchens, showing Raphael's picture to anyone who would look. No one had seen him. For 3 weeks, Victoria searched. She hired private investigators, posted rewards, even considered going to the media despite the potential damage to her reputation. But Raphael had vanished as completely as Jonathan had years before, leaving behind only the transformed garden and the memory of piano music in the empty house. The merger negotiations collapsed during her absence. Richard tried to salvage the deal, but the European partners had lost confidence in Ashford Fashion Empire's leadership. Months of careful planning evaporated in a matter of days. Victoria should have been devastated. The merger had represented everything she had worked toward, the culmination of her business ambitions. Instead, she felt only a hollow numbness, as if the part of her that cared about corporate success had left with Raphael. It was Mrs. Chen who finally forced her to stop searching. "You're killing yourself, dear one," the housekeeper said, finding Victoria slumped over her desk, surrounded by investigator reports and newspaper clippings. "He doesn't want to be found. Can't you see that?" Victoria looked up with bloodshot eyes. "I can't just give up," she said. "Not again." Mrs. Chen's expression softened with understanding. "You think this is your fault, don't you? You think if you had told him the truth about who he was, he would have stayed." Victoria didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. "Listen to me," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice gentle but firm. "That man loved you enough to leave when he thought his presence was hurting you. Maybe the kindest thing you can do is love him enough to let him go." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had been so focused on finding Raphael that she hadn't considered whether being found was what he actually wanted. His letter had been clear about his desire not to be pursued, but she had ignored his wishes in favor of her own desperate need to make things right. That night, Victoria stood in the garden Raphael had created, surrounded by dormant plants that would bloom again in spring. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the carefully arranged pathways with pristine white. In the moonlight, the space looked ethereal, magical, like something from a fairy tale. She thought about the man who had designed this sanctuary, who had coaxed beauty from neglected soil through patience and care. He had given her a gift that would last for years, a living reminder of the brief time when 2 broken people had found healing in each other's company. Maybe that was enough. Maybe some love stories weren't meant to have traditional endings. Maybe some connections were too precious to survive in the harsh light of everyday reality. Standing in Raphael's garden, Victoria made a decision that went against every instinct she possessed. She would stop looking for him. She would respect his choice to leave, even though it broke her heart to do so. But she would keep the garden, and she would remember. Winter deepened around the mansion, and Victoria slowly began to rebuild her life. The failed merger had damaged Ashford Fashion Empire's reputation, but not irreparably. She threw herself back into the work of running the company, though her approach had changed. She found herself making decisions based on more than just profit margins, considering the human impact of her choices in ways she never had before. Richard noticed the change immediately. There was something different in the way Victoria interacted with employees, a warmth that hadn't been there before. She instituted new policies, better healthcare coverage, more flexible schedules, support for workers facing personal crises. The board questioned some of these decisions, but Victoria held firm. "I learned something important recently," she told Richard during one particularly heated board meeting. "A company is only as strong as the people who run it, and people work better when they feel valued as human beings, not just economic units." The changes were subtle, but significant. Employee satisfaction improved, productivity increased, and slowly, Ashford Fashion Empire began to recover from the failed merger, stronger and more stable than before. But Victoria's personal life remained carefully controlled. She attended social functions when necessary, maintained her business relationships, and deflected any questions about romantic interests with practiced ease. Mrs. Chen worried about her isolation, but Victoria seemed content with her solitude. The only exception was the garden. Victoria spent hours there, learning to tend the plants that Raphael had chosen with such care. She discovered that gardening required a kind of patience she had never developed in business, the ability to nurture something slowly, trusting that time and consistency would eventually bear fruit. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the first blooms in Raphael's garden. Victoria stood among the emerging flowers, amazed by the transformation. What had looked dead and dormant just weeks before was now bursting with color and life. Daffodils pushed through the thawing soil, tulips unfurled their bright petals, and the cherry tree near the fountain was covered in delicate pink blossoms. It was while she was admiring the cherry blossoms that Victoria heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, expecting to see Mrs. Chen or perhaps one of the groundskeepers she had hired to help maintain Raphael's vision. Instead, she found herself looking at a man she almost didn't recognize. Raphael stood at the garden's entrance, but he was transformed. His hair was shorter, neatly trimmed, and his face was clean-shaven. He wore clothes that actually fit him. Dark jeans and a simple blue shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. Most dramatically, those eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. A sense of presence and purpose that spoke of recovered memories and renewed identity. "Hello, Victoria," he said. And his voice was different too. Stronger, more confident. The voice of a man who knew exactly who he was. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain still. "Hello, Raphael," she replied, testing the name to see how it felt. He smiled at that, an expression both sad and amused. "Actually," he said, "I go by Jonathan now. I remember who I am." The name hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning years of loss and confusion. Victoria felt her legs grow weak, and she reached out to steady herself against the cherry tree. The man standing before her was both stranger and beloved, familiar yet transformed. "Jonathan," she whispered, tasting the name she had forced herself to forget. "You remember everything." "Not everything," Jonathan replied, taking a careful step closer. "But enough. Enough to know why I disappeared. Enough to understand the pain I caused you. Enough to know that I owe you an explanation I should have given years ago." Victoria's mind raced with questions, but the most pressing one escaped her lips before she could stop it. "Where have you been? All these months? Where did you go?" Jonathan's expression grew troubled. "A facility in Oregon, a place that specializes in helping people recover from traumatic brain injuries. When I left here, I was starting to remember fragments, but they were all mixed up, painful. I needed professional help to piece them together properly." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Brain injury. That explained the memory loss, the confusion, the way he had seemed lost in his own mind when she found him in the alley. "What happened to you, Jonathan? What happened that day?" Jonathan looked around the garden, his gaze lingering on the fountain he had restored, the paths he had carefully designed. "Here," he said quietly. "Will you sit with me while I tell you? It's not an easy story." They settled on the stone bench near the fountain, the same spot where Victoria had watched him work through countless afternoons. The sound of water trickling over stone provided a gentle backdrop as Jonathan gathered his thoughts. "Do you remember the morning of our wedding?" he began. "How excited we both were. How perfect everything seemed." Victoria nodded, the memory sharp despite years of trying to suppress it. "You left early to get ready at your apartment. You said you wanted to surprise me by getting to the church first." Jonathan's hands clenched in his lap. "I was walking to my car when I saw him. Your father. He was waiting for me." The mention of her father made Victoria's blood run cold. Charles Ashford had died 5 years ago, taking many secrets to his grave. But she remembered his disapproval of Jonathan, his belief that a garden designer wasn't worthy of the Ashford name. "He told me we needed to talk," Jonathan continued. "Said there were things about you, about your family, that I needed to understand before I made the biggest mistake of my life." Victoria felt sick. "What did he tell you? That you were only marrying me to rebel against him? That you'd grown bored with society men and were amusing yourself with someone beneath your station? He said that once the novelty wore off, you'd realize your mistake and leave me for someone more appropriate." The words were like poison, designed to wound and destroy. Victoria could imagine her father delivering them with his characteristic cold precision, knowing exactly how to plant seeds of doubt in a young man's heart. "But that wasn't what broke me," Jonathan said, his voice growing quieter. "I might have fought through that. Might have convinced myself he was lying. But then he showed me the photographs." "Photographs?" Jonathan's jaw tightened with remembered pain. Pictures of you with Marcus Whitfield. At restaurants, at parties, in what looked like intimate moments. Your father said you'd been seeing him throughout our engagement, that the wedding was just a convenient cover while you figured out which man could offer you more. Victoria's breath caught. Marcus Whitfield had been a family friend, nothing more. But she remembered now how her father had insisted she attend certain social functions with Marcus when Jonathan was busy with work. He had claimed it was important for business relationships, that someone of her status couldn't appear at public events unescorted. Those photographs were staged, she said urgently. My father arranged those appearances. Marcus and I were never— I know that now, Jonathan interrupted gently. The doctors helped me work through the memories, separate the truth from the lies your father told me. But at the time, seeing those pictures after everything he'd said, it destroyed something inside me. Victoria could barely speak past the tightness in her throat. So you left. I was going to confront you, Jonathan said. I was angry, hurt, confused. I got in my car and started driving toward the church, but my emotions were so intense I couldn't think straight. I was crying, shaking, barely able to see the road. The water in the fountain seemed to grow louder as Victoria waited for him to continue. I never made it to the church, Jonathan said. I ran a red light and got hit by a truck. The impact threw me from the car. I was in a coma for 3 weeks. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Jonathan, we never knew. No one told us you'd been in an accident. Because your father made sure no one would tell you, Jonathan said, his voice hardening. When I finally woke up, he was there in my hospital room. I had severe brain trauma, couldn't remember much of anything. But he was very helpful in filling in the gaps. Victoria felt nauseated. What did he tell you? That you had called off the wedding when I didn't show up. That you were relieved to be free of an inappropriate engagement. He said you'd asked him to make sure I understood that any contact would be unwelcome. He offered to pay for my medical bills and ongoing care, but only if I agreed to disappear from your life completely. The cruelty of it took Victoria's breath away. Her father had used Jonathan's confusion and vulnerability to rewrite history, ensuring that the man she loved would never come back to her. I was so damaged, physically and mentally, that I believed him, Jonathan continued. I spent years drifting, trying to figure out who I was and why I felt so empty inside. The brain injury affected my short-term memory, made it hard to hold on to new information. I couldn't maintain steady employment, couldn't form lasting relationships. Eventually, I ended up on the streets. Victoria was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she imagined Jonathan's suffering. All those years, while she had believed he had abandoned her out of selfishness, he had been struggling with injuries and lies designed to keep them apart. I'm so sorry, she whispered. If I had known, if I had looked for you. You couldn't have known, Jonathan said firmly. Your father was very thorough in his deception. And by the time my memories started returning, years had passed. I assumed you'd moved on, built a life with someone else. I thought it would be cruel to disrupt your happiness just to ease my own conscience. But you did come back, Victoria said. You came back to me. Jonathan's expression softened. When you found me in that alley, something inside me recognized you even though my conscious mind couldn't place the memory. Being near you started a healing process I didn't understand. The gaps in my memory began to fill in, slowly at first, then faster. That's why you left, she realized, when the memories became too painful to handle alone. Jonathan nodded. I was terrified of what I might remember, and terrified of what it might mean for both of us. I needed professional help to sort through everything, to separate the real memories from the false ones your father had planted. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions churning inside her. Grief for the years they had lost, rage at her father's manipulation, and underneath it all, a tentative hope that perhaps they could find their way back to each other. The doctors helped me understand something important, Jonathan said eventually. Trauma doesn't just damage the brain, it damages the heart. I had to learn to trust my own memories again, to believe that love could be real and lasting, rather than just another illusion designed to hurt me. And have you learned that? Victoria asked, hardly daring to hope. Jonathan turned to face her fully, his green eyes clear and steady. I've learned that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. I've learned that love doesn't always follow convenient timelines or logical patterns. And I've learned that some bonds are strong enough to survive even the worst attempts to destroy them. Victoria felt her heart racing. What are you saying, Jonathan? I'm saying that I love you, Victoria Ashford. I loved you 8 years ago when I thought your name was the most beautiful sound in the world. I loved you when your father's lies convinced me you had betrayed me. I loved you during all those years when I couldn't remember your face, but felt an aching emptiness where you should have been. And I love you now, knowing everything that's happened, everything we've both been through. The words washed over Victoria like a wave, carrying away years of carefully constructed defenses. She had built her life around the belief that Jonathan had chosen to leave her, that their love hadn't been strong enough to overcome whatever obstacles he had faced. Now she understood that their separation had been engineered by someone who saw their happiness as a threat to his control. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and natural on her lips. I never stopped loving you, even when I tried to convince myself I had. Jonathan reached for her hand, and Victoria was struck by how different his touch felt now. Gone was the tentative uncertainty of Raphael. This was Jonathan, confident, purposeful, fully present in a way that made her feel completely seen. But there's something else I need to tell you, Jonathan said, his expression growing serious again. Something I learned about your father during my recovery. Victoria steeled herself for another revelation. What is it? He wasn't just trying to control your personal life, Jonathan said. He was embezzling money from Ashford fashion empire. Significant amounts, over several years. He used your engagement as a distraction, but he was also genuinely worried that an outsider might discover his financial manipulations. The news should have shocked Victoria, but instead, it filled in pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she was solving. Her father's insistence on controlling every aspect of the business. His paranoia about bringing in outside consultants or partners. The financial irregularities she had discovered after his death but had attributed to poor record-keeping. How do you know this? She asked. Because I wasn't the only person he paid to disappear, Jonathan said grimly. There was an accountant, a man named David Chen. Mrs. Chen's nephew, Victoria breathed, understanding flooding through her. That's why she recognized you. That's why she had that photograph. Jonathan nodded. David had stumbled onto evidence of your father's embezzlement. Instead of reporting it, your father offered him money to stay quiet and relocate. David took the money, but he also kept copies of the evidence. When he died in a car accident 2 years later, he left everything to his aunt. Mrs. Chen has been protecting me all these years, Victoria realized. She knew what my father was capable of, and she was trying to shield me from the truth. She's a remarkable woman, Jonathan agreed. When my memories started returning, I went to see her. She was the one who helped me understand the full scope of what your father had done. She's also the one who encouraged me to get professional help before trying to contact you again. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward the housekeeper who had become so much more than an employee. Mrs. Chen had watched over both of them, keeping their secrets and waiting patiently for the day when the truth could finally come to light. What happens now? Victoria asked, suddenly aware of how much their world had shifted in the space of a single conversation. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the garden he had created during those confused months when he was more Raphael than Jonathan. Now, I tell you something I should have said 8 years ago, he said finally. I want to marry you, Victoria. Not because it's convenient or expected, but because I can't imagine a life that doesn't include you in it. The proposal was simple, direct, free of the romantic gestures that had characterized their younger selves. But it carried a weight and sincerity that moved Victoria more than any elaborate declaration could have. Before she could respond, Jonathan continued. But I need you to understand what you'd be choosing. I'm not the same man I was 8 years ago. The brain injury changed me in ways that will probably never fully heal. I have good days and bad days. Sometimes my memory fails me. I may never be able to give you the kind of life you could have with someone else. Victoria studied his face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his renewed confidence. This was what made Jonathan different from every other man who had ever pursued her. His ability to be completely honest about his limitations, rather than trying to impress her with false strength. Do you want to know what I think? She said, taking his hand in both of hers. Jonathan nodded, though she could see the fear in his eyes. I think you're exactly the man I need, Victoria said firmly. 8 years ago, I was young and idealistic. I thought love meant finding someone perfect to complete me. Now I understand that love means finding someone worth growing with, someone who makes you want to become the best version of yourself. Jonathan's eyes brightened with hope, but he remained cautious. And the business? The social pressures? Are you prepared for the questions and gossip that will come with marrying someone like me? Victoria thought of Richard's concerns, of the board members who questioned her judgment, of the society friends who would undoubtedly whisper about her choices. Then she thought of the past few months, of how much happier she had been with Jonathan in her life, even when she hadn't known who he really was. "I've learned something important too," she said. "A company that can't survive one woman's personal happiness isn't much of a company, and friends who can't accept the person I choose to love aren't much of friends." Jonathan's smile was radiant, transforming his face in a way that reminded Victoria powerfully of the young man she had fallen in love with years ago. "Then, you'll marry me?" he asked. Victoria pretended to consider the question seriously. "Well," she said, "I suppose I could be convinced, but I have some conditions." "Name them," Jonathan said, laughing. "First, no more disappearing without explanation. If you're having a bad day or struggling with memories, you talk to me about it. We face things together." "Agreed," Jonathan said solemnly. "Second, we do this our way. No big society wedding, no media circus. Just us and the people who matter most." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Jonathan replied. "And third," Victoria said, her voice growing softer, "we promise to be patient with each other. Both of us have scars from what happened. Healing takes time." Jonathan lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "All the time in the world," he promised. As if summoned by their happiness, Mrs. Chen appeared on the garden path, carrying a tray with tea and small cakes. The elderly woman's face was bright with tears of joy as she approached. "I thought you might be ready for some refreshment," she said, setting the tray on the small table near their bench. "Mrs. Chen," Victoria said, rising to embrace the woman who had been more mother than employee to her. "Thank you. For everything. For keeping our secrets. For protecting us both. For believing that love could find a way." Mrs. Chen patted Victoria's back gently. "Some stories are worth preserving, dear one, even when they take longer to unfold than we might wish." As they settled around the small table, sharing tea and cakes in the garden that had brought them back together, Victoria felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. There would be challenges, she knew. Jonathan's recovery was ongoing, and there would be days when the past felt more real than the present. The business world would question her choices, and some relationships would not survive her decision to prioritize personal happiness over professional expectations. But sitting in the spring sunshine, listening to Jonathan and Mrs. Chen discuss plans for expanding the garden, Victoria found that the obstacles seemed manageable. They had survived the worst that could be thrown at them: lies, manipulation, trauma, and years of separation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Victoria and Jonathan walked through the mansion together. So much had changed since the autumn night when she had first brought a confused stranger home from a dark alley. The house that had once felt like a beautiful prison now felt like a sanctuary. In the conservatory where they had shared their first real conversation, Jonathan paused to examine the orchids that Mrs. Chen tended with such care. "I have an idea," he said, turning to Victoria with an expression of quiet excitement. "What if we converted part of the East Wing into a therapy center? A place where people recovering from brain injuries could come for treatment and support." Victoria considered the proposal, seeing how it would honor both Jonathan's experience and their shared commitment to helping others. It would also provide a meaningful purpose for the mansion beyond simple luxury. "We could partner with the hospital where you were treated," she suggested. "Create a comprehensive program that addresses both medical and emotional recovery." Jonathan's eyes lit up. "And we could incorporate gardening therapy. There's solid research showing that working with plants helps rebuild neural pathways damaged by trauma." As they discussed the possibilities, Victoria felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. But this time, it wasn't the thrill of a corporate acquisition or financial gain. It was the satisfaction of creating something that could genuinely improve people's lives. They talked late into the night, sketching out plans and dreams with the enthusiasm of partners in every sense of the word. Victoria found herself marveling at how naturally they worked together, how their different perspectives complemented rather than competed with each other. Near midnight, as they prepared to part ways for the evening, they had agreed to take their renewed relationship slowly, rebuilding intimacy along with trust. Jonathan caught Victoria's hand. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice uncertain for the first time that day. "What is it?" "I know this might seem strange, but would you mind if I kept the name Raphael as well? Not to replace Jonathan, but as a reminder of who I became during those months when I was lost." He's part of my story now, part of how I found my way back to you." Victoria smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. She had grown to love Raphael, his gentleness, his connection to growing things, his ability to find beauty in neglected spaces. The idea of losing that part of Jonathan felt like another kind of grief. "Jonathan Raphael Blake," she said, testing how the names sounded together. "It has a nice ring to it. And someday," Jonathan said, his voice full of promise, "it might be Jonathan Raphael Blake Ashford. If you're willing to share your name as well as your life." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and old dreams finally coming true. In the background, the fountain Jonathan had restored continued its gentle song, a testament to the patient work of healing that could transform even the most damaged things into sources of beauty. The next few weeks brought a flurry of activity as Victoria and Jonathan began the process of rebuilding their life together. The therapy center became more than just an idea, evolving into a detailed plan with architectural drawings and partnership agreements. Richard Hawthorne struggled to accept the changes in Victoria's priorities, but even he had to admit that her renewed energy and focus were good for business. The Ashford fashion empire began exploring new markets and innovative partnerships, driven by Victoria's expanded vision of what success could look like. The social challenges Victoria had anticipated proved less daunting than expected. Some friends and business associates did distance themselves, unable to reconcile her choices with their expectations. But others surprised her with their support, sharing their own stories of love found in unexpected places. Most importantly, Victoria and Jonathan settled into a rhythm that honored both their past and their future. They attended therapy sessions together, working through the lingering effects of trauma and separation. They spent hours in the garden, planning seasonal plantings and discussing the symbolism of growth and renewal. On a warm evening in late spring, they hosted their first dinner party together, a small gathering that included Mrs. Chen, several of Jonathan's doctors, and a few of Victoria's closest friends. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the kind of genuine warmth that comes from people who truly care about each other. As Victoria watched Jonathan tell a story about his attempts to train the mansion's resident cat to stay out of his flower beds, she felt a contentment that went deeper than happiness. This was what she had been searching for all her life without knowing it, a sense of belonging that came not from achievement or acquisition, but from being fully known and completely accepted by another person. After the guests departed, Victoria and Jonathan walked through the moonlit garden, checking on plants and discussing modifications to their therapy center plans. The space had become a living symbol of their relationship, carefully tended, constantly growing, beautiful in its imperfection. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had married 8 years ago?" Victoria asked as they paused beside the cherry tree where they had been reunited. Jonathan considered the question seriously. "I think we would have been happy," he said finally. "But I'm not sure we would have been ready for this kind of happiness. Sometimes the most important journeys require detours." Victoria nodded, understanding what he meant. Their younger selves had loved deeply but naively, believing that love alone could overcome any obstacle. Their older selves loved more wisely, with full awareness of how precious and fragile happiness could be. As they prepared to go inside, Jonathan picked a single cherry blossom from the tree above them. He tucked it gently behind Victoria's ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing something worth saving in a broken man, for giving me time to heal, for choosing love even when it wasn't convenient or easy." Victoria covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. "Thank you for coming back," she replied, "for fighting through the confusion and pain to find your way home." They stood together in the garden they had created, surrounded by the promise of flowers yet to bloom and dreams yet to be fulfilled. The past had left its scars on both of them, but those scars had become part of their story rather than the end of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. The therapy center would require months of planning and preparation. There would be setbacks and difficulties, moments when the weight of their shared trauma threatened to overwhelm their progress. But tonight, standing in the moonlight with cherry blossoms drifting around them like snow, Victoria and Jonathan knew that they had something worth any struggle. A love that had survived the worst attempts to destroy it and emerged stronger for the testing. The garden whispered its approval in the night breeze, and the fountain sang its eternal song of renewal and hope. In a world where so many stories ended in sorrow, theirs was just beginning again. The weeks that followed their reunion passed in a haze of rediscovered intimacy and shared dreams. Victoria and Jonathan moved carefully through the process of rebuilding trust, each day bringing small victories and occasional setbacks. The therapy center plans progressed from concept to reality, with construction set to begin in the fall. But their happiness faced its greatest test on a humid July evening, when Victoria received a phone call that would shake the foundation of everything they had built together. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Jonathan's neurologist in Oregon. Her tone was professional, but tinged with concern that made Victoria's stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm calling about Jonathan's recent test results. We need to discuss some developments in his condition." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of developments?" "The scans show some irregularities that weren't present during his initial treatment. I'd prefer to discuss this in person, but Jonathan has been avoiding my calls. I thought you might be able to persuade him to come in for a comprehensive evaluation." After ending the call, Victoria found Jonathan in the garden, deadheading roses with the methodical precision that had become his trademark. The sight of him working so peacefully made her hesitate to shatter the moment with difficult news. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "Dr. Morrison called." His hands stilled on the rose stems, and Victoria saw his shoulders tense. "What did she want?" "She wants you to come in for more tests. She mentioned some irregularities in your scans." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and he turned away from her, focusing intently on the flowers. "I'm fine, Victoria. Better than I've been in years. These doctors see problems where none exist. But what if she's right?" Victoria pressed gently. "What if there's something we need to address? What if there is?" Jonathan's voice carried an edge of desperation that alarmed her. "What if they tell me that my recovery is temporary? That I'm going to lose my memories again, lose you again? Some things are better left unknown." The fear in his voice broke Victoria's heart. She understood his reluctance. They had just found their way back to each other, and the prospect of losing that again seemed unbearable. But she also knew that ignoring potential problems wouldn't make them disappear. "We'll face whatever comes together," she said, reaching for his hand. "Just like we promised." Jonathan pulled away, his expression shuddered. "You don't understand, Victoria. You can't promise to face something like that with me. If my condition deteriorates, if I become a burden—" "You're not a burden," Victoria interrupted fiercely. "You never have been, and you never will be." But Jonathan was already walking away, his retreat so reminiscent of his earlier disappearance that Victoria felt panic rise in her throat. She wanted to follow him, to force him to listen to reason, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the memory of Mrs. Chen's words about loving someone enough to let them go. That night, Jonathan didn't come to dinner. Victoria found him in the conservatory, sitting at the piano with his hands resting motionless on the keys. The instrument had become his refuge during difficult moments. But tonight he wasn't playing. "You're afraid," Victoria said, settling beside him on the bench. "Terrified," Jonathan admitted. "These past months with you have been the most precious of my life. The thought of losing that, of forgetting you again." "Then let's make sure that doesn't happen," Victoria said firmly. "Let's go to Oregon together. Let's get the information we need to fight whatever this is." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the piano keys without making sound. "What if the news is bad? What if there's nothing we can do?" "Then we'll love each other through it," Victoria replied simply. "For as long as we have, in whatever way we can." The next week, they flew to Oregon together. The medical center was housed in a modern building surrounded by carefully maintained gardens, a detail that Jonathan appreciated even in his anxiety. Dr. Morrison greeted them with the kind of professional warmth that put patients at ease while preparing them for difficult conversations. The comprehensive evaluation took 2 days. Victoria waited in the hospital cafe during the lengthy tests, trying to focus on work emails but finding her attention scattered. She watched other families dealing with their own medical crises and felt a kinship with their quiet courage. When Dr. Morrison finally called them into her office, Victoria could read nothing from her expression. Jonathan sat rigidly beside her, his hand cold when she reached for it. "I'll be direct, Doctor," Morrison said, settling behind her desk with Jonathan's file. "The irregularities we detected are consistent with a rare form of progressive cognitive decline. It's related to the original trauma you suffered, but it's been dormant until recently." Victoria felt the room spin around her. "How progressive?" she managed to ask. "That's difficult to predict," Dr. Morrison replied honestly. "In some patients, the decline is rapid and severe. In others, it progresses slowly over many years. There are treatments that can help slow the process, but there's no cure. Jonathan's hand tightened on Victoria's, and she could feel him trembling. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Morrison's expression softened. "That's impossible to say with certainty. But I want to be clear about something. This doesn't negate the progress you've made. The memories you've recovered, the healing you've achieved, those are real and valuable regardless of what happens in the future." The drive back to their hotel passed in heavy silence. Jonathan stared out the window at the passing landscape, his face a mask of controlled despair. Victoria searched for words that might comfort him, but found none that didn't sound hollow. In their hotel room, Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed and finally spoke. "I can't ask you to go through this with me, Victoria. I won't watch you sacrifice your life to care for someone who might not even remember your name." Victoria felt anger flare in her chest, not at Jonathan, but at the cruel irony of fate that would threaten their happiness just as they had found it again. But beneath the anger was a fierce determination that surprised her with its strength. "You're not asking me to do anything," she said, moving to stand directly in front of him. "I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you, whatever comes." "You don't know what you're saying," Jonathan protested. "You haven't seen what this kind of decline looks like. The confusion, the personality changes, the slow loss of everything that makes a person who they are." Victoria knelt beside the bed, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, Jonathan Blake. 8 years ago, I lost you because other people made choices for us. I won't let that happen again. Whatever time we have, whether it's 50 years or 5, I want to spend it with you." Tears spilled down Jonathan's cheeks, and Victoria felt her own eyes fill in response. "But what about your life, your company, your dreams?" "My dreams have changed," Victoria said softly. "They used to be about building an empire, about proving I could succeed in a man's world. Now they're about creating something meaningful with the person I love, about making sure that our story, whatever its ending, is one worth telling." That night, they held each other without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts about an uncertain future. Victoria found herself memorizing the feel of Jonathan's heartbeat against her chest, the way his breathing changed as he drifted towards sleep, the warmth of his arms around her. The next morning brought an unexpected conversation with Dr. Morrison. She had been thinking about their case overnight and wanted to discuss an experimental treatment program being conducted at a research facility in Switzerland. "It's not a cure," she emphasized during their video call, "but early results suggest it might significantly slow the progression of symptoms. The treatment would require a 6-month commitment, and there are no guarantees." Victoria looked at Jonathan, seeing hope war with resignation in his expression. "What are the risks?" she asked. "Minimal, from a physical standpoint," Dr. Morrison replied. "The real risk is emotional, the disappointment if the treatment doesn't work as hoped." "We'll do it," Victoria said before Jonathan could voice any objections. "Whatever it takes." "Victoria," Jonathan began, but she silenced him with a look. "We'll do it together," she repeated firmly. The decision to pursue the experimental treatment marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time since his diagnosis, Jonathan began to fight alongside Victoria, rather than trying to protect her from the battle. They researched the Swiss facility together, made arrangements for their extended absence, and planned for the possibility that the treatment might not succeed. Mrs. Chen took the news with the stoic grace Victoria had come to expect from her. The housekeeper had weathered too many storms to be shaken by the prospect of another, and her quiet confidence became an anchor for both of them. Before they left for Switzerland, Victoria made a decision that shocked the business world and delighted her heart. She announced that she was stepping down as CEO of Ashford Fashion Empire, appointing Richard Hawthorne as her successor while retaining her position as chairman of the board. The move generated headlines and speculation, but Victoria found that she cared less about public opinion than she ever had before. The company would thrive under Richard's leadership, and she would remain involved enough to ensure its continued success while having the freedom to prioritize her personal life. Switzerland proved to be exactly what they both needed. The research facility was nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains, and the peaceful setting provided a respite from the intensity of the previous months. The treatment itself was rigorous, but not unbearable. A combination of medications, cognitive therapy, and lifestyle modifications designed to support brain health. More importantly, the other patients in the program became an unexpected source of strength and community. Victoria and Jonathan found themselves part of a group of couples facing similar challenges, each dealing with different forms of cognitive decline but united in their determination to fight for their relationships. During their time in Switzerland, Victoria and Jonathan were married in a simple ceremony at a small chapel overlooking Lake Geneva. The only witnesses were two other couples from the treatment program and the facility's chaplain. But Victoria couldn't have imagined a more perfect celebration of their love. The exchange of vows was deeply personal, each word chosen to reflect their unique journey. Jonathan promised to love Victoria for all the days he could remember and trust her to love him through the days he might not. Victoria promised to be his memory when his failed, and his strength when his wavered. As the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Victoria felt a completeness she had never experienced before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners in the truest sense of the word. The treatment program showed promising results. Jonathan's cognitive tests remained stable throughout their 6-month stay, and some even showed improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic but emphasized that the real test would come in the months and years that followed. Returning to New York felt like coming home to a new life. The therapy center construction was nearing completion, and Victoria threw herself into the final preparations with enthusiasm that surprised everyone who knew her. The woman who had once lived for board meetings and acquisition deals now found her greatest satisfaction in designing programs that would help other families navigate the challenges they had faced. The center opened on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Victoria had first found Jonathan in the alley. The timing felt symbolic, a full circle completion of their journey from loss to healing. The facility included medical treatment rooms, therapy spaces, and a magnificent garden that served as both therapy tool and sanctuary. Jonathan took the lead in developing the horticultural therapy program, working with patients to create healing spaces while rebuilding their own cognitive connections. Victoria marveled at his patience and intuition, watching him guide confused and frustrated individuals towards small victories that rebuilt their confidence along with their abilities. Mrs. Chen remained a central figure in their lives, her wisdom and steady presence providing continuity through all their changes. She had become the unofficial grandmother to the therapy center, treating staff and patients with the same mixture of care and no-nonsense guidance that had helped Victoria and Jonathan find their way back to each other. As winter approached, Victoria and Jonathan established new rhythms in their shared life. They attended regular medical checkups, maintained Jonathan's treatment protocols, and celebrated each milestone, each clear test result, each retained memory, each day of stability. But more than that, they learned to live fully in the present while planning thoughtfully for the future. They traveled together, visiting gardens around the world, and bringing back ideas for their therapy programs. They entertained friends at their home, creating the kind of warm, inclusive atmosphere that had been missing from Victoria's earlier life. On a snowy evening in December, as they sat together in the conservatory watching snowflakes drift past the windows, Victoria reflected on the transformation of their lives. The woman who had once prized control above all else had learned to find peace in uncertainty. The man who had lost himself completely had discovered that identity could be rebuilt stronger than before. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonathan asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Giving up the corporate world for this quieter life?" Victoria considered the question seriously. She thought about the merger that had failed, the business relationships that had suffered, the social status she had sacrificed. Then she looked at Jonathan, his face peaceful in the lamplight, his hand warm in hers. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Jonathan smiled, the expression lighting up his features in a way that still took her breath away. "Even if my condition worsens? Even if I become the burden I was afraid of being?" "Especially then," Victoria replied without hesitation. "Love isn't about convenience, Jonathan. It's about choosing someone every day, regardless of circumstances." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform their garden into a winter wonderland. The therapy center would be closed for the holiday week, giving them time to rest and reconnect away from the demands of their work. As midnight approached, marking the anniversary of their first conversation in this very room, Victoria felt a deep gratitude for the winding path that had brought them to this moment. Their love story hadn't followed conventional patterns. It had been interrupted by tragedy, complicated by deception, and threatened by illness. But perhaps that was what made it so precious. The next morning brought news that would test their newfound equilibrium one final time. Dr. Morrison called with results from Jonathan's latest tests, and her voice carried an excitement that was unmistakable even through the phone connection. "The experimental treatment has exceeded all our expectations," she announced. "Not only has Jonathan's condition stabilized, but we're seeing actual improvement in several key areas. It's unprecedented for this type of cognitive decline. Victoria felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she watched Jonathan's face transform with hope and disbelief. The sword that had hung over their heads for months was finally being lifted. "Does this mean he's cured?" Victoria asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "We never use the word cured in neurology," Dr. Morrison replied carefully. "But the prognosis is extraordinarily positive. With continued treatment and monitoring, there's every reason to believe that Jonathan can maintain his current level of function indefinitely." After ending the call, Victoria and Jonathan sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they had just learned. The future that had seemed so uncertain was suddenly bright with possibility. That evening, they walked through their snow-covered garden, their breath visible in the cold air as they talked about dreams they had been afraid to voice. The therapy center could expand, perhaps opening satellite locations in other cities. They could travel more extensively, exploring the world together without the shadow of declining health hanging over them. But the most precious possibility was simpler than any grand plan: the knowledge that they would have time to grow old together, to celebrate anniversaries and milestones, to watch their therapy center help countless other families find hope in the midst of crisis. As they reached the fountain at the garden's heart, now silent under a blanket of snow, Jonathan stopped and turned to face Victoria. The moonlight caught the snowflakes in her hair, and he was struck by how beautiful she looked in this moment of perfect happiness. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" "For believing in us when I couldn't. For fighting for our future when I was ready to give up. For showing me that love really can conquer all. Not by magic, but by choosing it every single day." Victoria stood on tiptoe to kiss him, tasting snowflakes and promises on his lips. "Thank you for coming back to me," she whispered against his mouth. "For fighting through the confusion and pain to find your way home." They held each other in the winter garden, surrounded by the dormant plants that would bloom again in spring. Their love story had weathered every storm that life could throw at it: betrayal, loss, illness, and fear. Now they stood on the threshold of a future bright with promise and possibility. The therapy center would help other couples find the strength to fight for their relationships. The Ashford fashion empire would continue to thrive under new leadership, proof that success could be measured in more than profit margins. And Victoria and Jonathan would grow old together, their garden a living testament to the patient work of healing and renewal. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the beginning of a new day. Victoria and Jonathan walked hand in hand back toward their home, leaving footprints in the fresh snow that would be covered by morning, but feeling the solid ground beneath their feet. Their story had been written in fragments, memories lost and found, loves interrupted and renewed, dreams deferred but never abandoned. Now, finally, they were writing the ending together, and it was more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to imagine. The house welcomed them with warm light and the promise of tomorrow. Mrs. Chen had left tea and small cakes in the kitchen, a note wishing them sweet dreams and sweeter tomorrows. The piano in the conservatory waited for Jonathan's morning practice, and Victoria's desk held plans for new programs and possibilities. But tonight, they simply held each other in the bed they shared, listening to the gentle sound of snow against the windows and feeling grateful for every moment that had led them to this perfect peace. Victoria thought of the woman she had been a year ago, driven, lonely, convinced that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a story she had read long ago. The woman she had become was softer but stronger, successful but not consumed by success, complete in a way that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with connection. Jonathan thought of the lost man he had been, wandering through a world that made no sense, carrying pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. That man's suffering had led him to this moment of absolute contentment, lying beside the woman who had always been his home. As sleep claimed them both, they dreamed of gardens in bloom, of laughter echoing through therapy center halls, of anniversary celebrations yet to come. They dreamed of a love that had survived everything the world could throw at it and emerged not just intact, but transformed into something larger and more luminous than either had thought possible. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their world in pristine white. But beneath the surface, spring was already stirring, preparing for the explosion of life and color that would come with warmth and time. It was the perfect metaphor for their love, patient, persistent, and ultimately unstoppable. Their story was complete now, but it was also just beginning. Every day would bring new chapters, new challenges, new opportunities to choose love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. And they would write those chapters together, their voices joining in harmony, like the garden fountain and the winter wind, creating something beautiful from the raw materials of human experience. In the morning, they would wake to a world bright with snow and possibility. They would drink coffee together in the conservatory, plan the day's work at the therapy center, and walk through their garden discussing dreams and details with equal enthusiasm. They would live the kind of quiet, extraordinary life that comes from understanding what truly matters. But tonight, they simply held each other and were grateful. Grateful for second chances and patient love, for Mrs. Chen's wisdom and Dr. Morrison's care, for the therapy center families who had become extended family, for the garden that had brought them together and the home that sheltered their happiness. Grateful, most of all, for the love that had waited for them through years of separation, confusion, and fear. The love that had recognized them when they couldn't recognize themselves. The love that had been patient enough to heal, strong enough to endure, and wise enough to know that some stories are worth any amount of waiting. As the clock in the hallway chimed the hour, Victoria and Jonathan settled deeper into sleep, their breathing synchronized, their dreams intertwined. Tomorrow would bring its own gifts and challenges, but they would meet them together, as they had promised, as they would continue to promise for all the years to come. The house grew quiet around them, keeping watch over their rest like a faithful guardian. The snow fell softly outside, and somewhere in the distance, the city continued its restless movement. But here, in this bedroom, in this mansion surrounded by gardens both dormant and ever-growing, perfect peace reigned. Their love story was finished now, but it would never really end. It would live on in the couples who found help at their therapy center, in the gardens that bloomed from the seeds of Jonathan's vision, in the quiet revolution of a business empire that had learned to value human happiness alongside profit margins. It would live on in Mrs. Chen's smile when she saw them together, in Dr. Morrison's research that would help other families facing similar challenges, in the small daily miracles of two people who had learned to see each other clearly and love what they saw. Most of all, it would live on in the simple truth that some bonds cannot be broken by time or circumstance, trauma or fear. Some love is strong enough to bridge any gap, patient enough to wait through any darkness, and wise enough to know that the most precious things in life are worth fighting for, no matter how long the fight might take. Victoria and Jonathan had learned this truth the hard way, through years of separation and pain, but they had learned it completely, and it had transformed them both into people capable of the kind of love that changes not just individual lives, but the world around them. In their sleep they smiled, and the house smiled with them. The story was complete, but the love would go on forever, writing itself across seasons and years, constant as the turning earth and certain as the promise of spring.